الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين نحمده ونصلي ونسلم على رسوله الكريم أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Hope everyone's doing well. We started our discussions of the literal and the metaphorical in the previous lesson, and we're going to be continuing that today. We're going to hopefully finish off the discussion of the literal and the metaphorical. And I think first of all, I want to just recap some of the concepts that we covered in the previous lesson. The first two concepts of the literal and the metaphorical. So if you recall, the literal and the metaphorical have 6 total. So when they discuss when we said we're talking about the literal and the metaphorical, haqiqa majaz, when we started that topic, I said there were 6 subtopics within that, or 6 sub-principles within that, or 6 subcategories, whatever word you want to say, right? 6 discussions. So we covered the first 2 of them in the previous lesson. I want to kind of recap that, because in order to understand the third principle, you kind of have to understand the first 2. You don't have to, but it just helps to get a holistic picture of what's going on. And then we'll move on and cover the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and hopefully, inshallah, the 6th principle as well. So, if you recall, the first principle that we covered in the previous lesson was, we said that if the literal meaning, if it's possible to take the ruling from the literal meaning of the sentence, then the metaphorical meaning has no consideration, right? Now, I just want to explore that, right? So we already said that because the metaphorical meaning is borrowed, and something which is borrowed, so it's a borrowed meaning, right? That word doesn't actually have that meaning inherently, but it's borrowing that meaning. And so therefore that word is, so that meaning is kind of like a temporary resident. And so therefore something that's temporary or borrowed, right, can never be in competition with the default. Remember we said all of that? So that was the first principle, but I want to talk about that. I kind of just want to talk about how sentences work when we're talking about default and literal, right? And this principle will kind of make more sense when we talk about that. So inshallah, that's the first thing we'll discuss. And then the second thing is, we then talked about how if you have a common metaphorical meaning, so a commonly used metaphorical meaning, and the literal meaning is impossible or unused, well then we automatically just assume the metaphorical meaning and we ignore the literal meaning, right? So because of the usage and the common understanding, the metaphorical meaning is abandoned in these 2 cases because they can't really be used, right? And then we talked about the case where you had a common literal meaning, so the literal meaning is commonly used, and the metaphorical meaning is also commonly used. Well then, what do you do in that situation? So there was 2 opinions. The default is the literal, right? But so that's why Imam Abu Hanifa says we take the literal, but Sahibain, they had a bit more of a nuanced position. They said that, well, the metaphorical meaning is universal and it includes the literal within it. Well, then we take the metaphorical meaning because the metaphorical meaning also contains the literal. So it's containing the default as well. And so we can take this, what's called the universal metaphorical or umumul majaz. So we talked about that in the previous lesson, right? Today now we're going to be moving on to looking at the literal and the metaphorical, and to what extent can the metaphorical act as a substitute for the literal, right? So we've already said the literal is the default and the metaphorical is borrowed, right? And it's kind of like a temporary meaning that this word takes on. So to what extent can the metaphorical substitute the literal, right? We're going to be looking at that in kind of a very theoretical way. So again, it's going to be quite abstract. So come with your thinking caps. Thereafter, we'll look at the discussion of literal versus metaphorical, and if they have two completely separate meanings, then very similar to homonyms, you can't take both meanings at the same time, right? And we'll discuss that. And then we've got then the fifth principle is looking at the association between the literal and the metaphorical, and how and the the different types of associations between literal and metaphorical. So the metaphorical meaning has to come from somewhere, right? So how is it associated to the literal meaning, and how does this type of association affect how you use that metaphorical meaning? So we'll discuss that. And then finally, we're gonna round it off with a list of reasons why the literal meaning might be abandoned. So again, a packed lesson today, inshallah. So let's get into it. Just one thing I forgot to mention in the previous lesson. This is a book that I found very useful when preparing for this lesson. This is Usul al-Shashi is a usul book that many students studying usul in the Hanafi madhab will start with. So a lot of students start with a study of this book. It's slightly more detailed than the book we're covering, right? It has more detail, and but it also does throw you into the deep end a bit. Well, all usul does, to be honest. So yeah, this is the Arabic copy that I've got here at the moment, Usul al-Shashi. So this edition that I showed you previously, this one, this has been translated by somebody called Dr. Mansour Ali. And it's been published by Turath Publishing. A couple years back. I've had this for a while. But it's actually a good translation. So it's a very good translation, and it also has explanation, which is the useful point about this book. So if you recall previously, I showed you this book, this translation. So this is a translation of Mabadiul Usul, and Mabadiul Usul is the book that we're actually covering. I don't have my Arabic copy here, somewhere else, but the Arabic copy that we're covering, the Arabic book that we're covering is Mabadiul Usul, and this is just a translation of that. Now the issue with this book is it's a translation, and it's good and it's useful, but it doesn't have any additional explanation. So as like a specification of everything that we're covering in this course, then this will be useful to you. But if you want any additional explanation, then that book won't provide it. You're going to have to listen to my lectures, right? Now, that's the reason why I'm kind of showing you this book. This book, Usul al-Shashi, the layout is slightly different. So the ordering of the concepts are slightly different, but a lot of the concepts are covered in here. And it has some different examples. But the benefit is it's a very good translation, but the translator also adds additional explanation in the footnotes. So where the translation might be a bit unintuitive, or the English reader might not necessarily fully understand what the Arabic what the Arabic is trying to say, or what the translation is trying to say, he'll add explanation in the footnotes, which makes this very, very useful. And it's got, so yeah, that's especially, so the reason I'm mentioning this now and not like at the beginning of the year or whatever, is because for the topic of the literal and the metaphorical, it seems Mabadiul Usul has heavily borrowed from Usul al-Shashi. And so therefore, an explanation, so many of the concepts found in Mabadiul Usul that we're discussing in regards to the literal and the metaphorical seem to have been taken from this book. And so if you want to see the extra detail on those topics, they can be found in this book. And I benefited heavily from this book. So yeah, again, I do want to caveat all of this by saying that you don't need to buy any of these books to benefit from the course and to succeed in the course. The lectures should be sufficient, right? I've actually, used all of these books myself to help in the explanation of the notes and in the explanation that I give. So a lot of the content I will give, and if there's something I've missed, then it's usually due to because I think that that's unnecessary, or it's too complicated, or too much additional explanation that will just overcomplicate things. And so yeah, that book exists, and it's useful for anybody who wants additional information, or for anybody who wants some kind of additional explanation on a topic that we've covered, but it's not necessary, and you don't need to necessarily have it. But if you want to look into usul in more detail, then that is a good book in English to have. So yeah, with that, let's get into the lesson, inshallah. Okay, so continuing our discussions of the literal and the metaphorical from the previous lesson, now that you've kind of got a taste of the literal and the metaphorical and the sort of rules that we're discussing, I just want to backtrack and look at this whole thing a bit more practically. We're going to go to theoretical in a minute, but let's look at the practical first and just look at it in a more holistic way. Let's go back to first principles, actually. So I say a sentence. Every sentence usually is constructed of some kind of subject of the sentence and the predicate of the sentence. So every sentence usually has a subject and a predicate. So the subject is usually the thing the sentence is talking about, right? So, for example, if I say, this is a hand, or actually, let's not say that. That is a dog, or that is a hat, right? Let's say that is a hat. The subject of that sentence is the thing I'm pointing to, that, right? I'm pointing to something. That's the subject of the sentence. I'm telling you, in the sentence, I'm telling you about this thing that I'm pointing to, right? So the subject is this thing I'm pointing to, that, right? And then I am then going to give you the predicate or the information about that thing. So then I say, is a hat, or that. So that, the subject, and what am I telling you about it? What information am I giving you about that thing, that subject? Well, it is a hat. That's the predicate. So you have a subject and you have information. So you have a subject and then the information that you're delivering about that subject. So that is how sentences work. Now, if I say to you, that is a hat, or that is a dog, or that is a lion, or whatever I say, so the subject is that thing that I'm pointing to, that, right? And the information is that it is a dog or a hat or a lion or whatever I said about it. Now, that's how sentences work. Now, how does literal and metaphorical play into this? Well, when I say that is a hat, the initial understanding, or the default understanding of that is the literal, right? When I say that is a hat, without any context, without any indication, without any other information at all, if I just say that is a hat, then what the listener understands, or the reader or whatever understands, is the literal meaning of that. You're going to understand that I am pointing to something, the subject of the sentence is something that I am indicating towards, and that it is a literal hat, right? So that thing that I'm pointing to is a hat. So that's what you understand. You're not going to understand you're not going to instantly assume a metaphorical meaning unless you have some kind of context or reason to think that I meant it metaphorically. So if I point and say that is a dog, then you're going to assume I'm talking about the mammal, that I'm indicating to something, and that thing that I'm indicating to is the four-legged mammal, that barks and has a tail, etc. That animal, that if you look in the dictionary under dog, or you do a search for what a dog looks like, then that will come up. You're not going to assume that I'm insulting, that what I'm pointing to is a human and that I'm insulting him, right? You're not going to instantly assume that. And if you do, then there's a reason why you're assuming that. You can only go to a metaphorical meaning when you have a certain reason. And that's going to be the sixth principle that we discuss, reasons why the literal meaning is abandoned, right? We're going to talk about that later. But just to start, the default is the literal. When I say a sentence, you instantly assume the literal, unless you have some kind of reason to assume something else. And these reasons are what we're covering. So the first principle that we covered in the previous lesson was when it's possible to act upon the sentence in the literal meaning of the sentence. So my sentence, that is a dog, when it's possible for you to act on that sentence that you heard act on the literal meaning of that sentence, well, then you're not going to go to any metaphorical meaning. So if you saw me and I said, that is a dog, your instant default assumption is that I am speaking literally and not metaphorically. Right? Because if I was speaking metaphorically, well, then that's a borrowed meaning. So if I'm saying that is a dog and I'm actually pointing at a person and I'm insulting him, right? Because I really hate that person, for example, let's say, and well, then you've now got additional information. You've now had to use some additional information in order to understand that metaphorical meaning. And that person isn't actually a dog. Like, the linguistic meaning of dog doesn't apply to that person. If you go in the dictionary and look at every single word I said and looked up dog, it wouldn't say, it wouldn't give you a picture of that person or the name of that person that I was pointing to. What I've done is I've borrowed the meaning of dog here to apply to that person. So it's a borrowed meaning. Now that borrowed meaning is temporary. Any other time I use dog, I'm not going to be using that person. I'm not going to be necessarily indicating to that person again. So it is borrowed. So the default is the dictionary meaning, and this borrowed meaning can never compete with the default meaning. And you have to have a reason to abandon this literal meaning. And then likewise, sometimes the metaphorical meaning can be very commonly known, right? So let's say everybody is referring to this person as a dog, right? Maybe because he looks like one, or because he acts like one, or maybe just because, he's a spineless person and everybody wants to insult him. So that's where we have our multiple types of literals, right? So, for example, if you had the sentence, I'm not going to eat from this tree, or I'm not going to eat from this pot, well, then the literal meaning there doesn't make any sense at all. The literal meaning of that is either impossible, right, in terms of the pot. You can't eat the pot. It's not possible for you to eat that pot, right? Except with great difficulty. So maybe pulverize the pot or something, or the tree is a better example of great difficulty. You're not going to be able to eat that tree unless you go out of your way to great lengths of difficulty to make that sentence true in its literal form. However, these sentences have a very commonly understood metaphorical meaning, right? Which is that, as we explained in the previous lesson, that this I'm going to eat this tree. Sorry, I'm not going to eat from this tree, i.e. the fruits of the tree, or from the profits of the tree, or I'm not going to eat from the contents of the pot, right? That's a very commonly understood metaphorical meaning, right? To the extent that many of you would have probably thought that that was the literal meaning. Now, in both of these cases, we said that actually you take the metaphorical meaning, right? You don't go with the literal, because the literal is either abandoned or it's as well. In these cases, the literal is impossible or difficult to achieve without going to great lengths of difficulty, right? And likewise, the same ruling is if the literal meaning was abandoned. So the example was, I'm not going to place my foot in this person's house. I'm not going to step foot in that person's house. We don't take the literal meaning, we mean the metaphorical meaning of entry. That's just commonly understood. The literal meaning is never used, never meant, right? And so it's as if we basically don't consider that literal meaning. Then the final one, in the final possibility, the final type of literal was where the literal meaning is commonly used and the metaphorical meaning is commonly used. Well, then what do you do in that case? Well, then there was a difference of opinion, and I'm not going to go back into that, right? You can look at the previous lesson for that. Why am I saying all of this? Because you understand now that the literal meaning is the default. The metaphorical meaning is a substitute. Well, it's not even a substitute, it's a alternative. But it can, to what extent is it an alternative? Right? To what extent can it be a substitute? So that is the third principle that we need to discuss. To what extent can the metaphorical meaning replace the literal? So if the literal meaning doesn't make sense linguistically, can the metaphorical meaning substitute it? So that's what we need to look at. First of all, in order to even go to a metaphorical, the literal meaning, the sentence has to literally have a meaning, right? What does that mean? I can't just say a stream of gibberish, words that don't mean anything, and expect you to take a metaphorical meaning from that, right? Over there, the metaphorical meaning is not even possible because there is no literal meaning. So if I just told you a stream of, if I just said chair, window, I don't know, chair, window, tree, what do you understand from that? Nothing. So there's no literal meaning here to understand. Chair, window, tree. There's no literal meaning there to understand. That's not a sentence. There's no subject, there's no predicate. You can't understand anything from that. So we can't even take a metaphorical meaning here. You don't even go to a metaphorical meaning because there's no literal meaning to understand. So in other words, because the literal meaning is not possible, the metaphorical meaning is also not possible. Does that make sense? Because the literal meaning doesn't exist, well then there's no possibility of the metaphorical substituting, because the metaphorical is a substitute for the default, right? But the default has to exist. You can't substitute something that wasn't there. In order for the metaphorical to substitute something, that thing has to exist, right? It's like in a football match, somebody's got a red card. Well, you can't substitute that player now. That person now does not exist on the pitch. There's only 10 players on the pitch. There's not 11. So now if you want to substitute the person who was sent off, well, that player doesn't no longer exist within the game. So you can't now substitute somebody in exchange for that sent off player, right? Again, that's just an example that came to my head right now. I'm sure there are better ones. So the sentence has to linguistically have a literal meaning in order for you to even consider a metaphorical, right? So now when we say, to what extent does the metaphorical substitute the literal, that's our first mode that we need to think about. Now that you've understood that, we can actually get into the third principle. So Imam Abu Hanifa says, so every scholar agrees with what we've said so far, that in order to go to a metaphorical meaning, the sentence has to make sense in terms of Arabic. Like the sentence has to make sense in terms of being a sentence, in terms of the sentence has to, be a valid sentence. There has to be information conveyed. The literal meaning has to exist. There has to be some kind of literal information conveyed. In terms of it being speech, it has to make sense. Everybody agrees with that. Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Abu Yusuf, Imam Muhammad, they all agree with that. However, thereafter there's a dispute, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa says, as long as the literal meaning exists, well, then the metaphorical meaning can substitute it. So effectively, so that's what Imam Abu Hanifa says. We'll park Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion for now, and we'll come back to it after we do Sahibain's opinion. Because I think it's easier to understand his once you understand Sahibain's. You've understood it so far, but you can't understand why Imam Abu Hanifa is saying that unless you understand what Sahibain is saying. So Sahibain say, so Imam Abu Hanifa says, once the literal meaning makes sense from just has a meaning, i.e. the literal meaning exists, well then the metaphorical meaning, then the metaphorical meaning can be taken, regardless of whether that literal meaning is inconceivable or not, right? That's a hint to what's coming. Now the Sahibain say that the linguistic meaning, the metaphorical meaning can only substitute the literal in outcome. So the literal meaning has to, number one, exist. Number two, it also has to make sense. When I say it has to make sense, it can't be inconceivable, right? So I can't say this chair is a dog. That's an inconceivable sentence, right? You look at the definition of chair and the definition of dog, there's no overlap between them. So the sentence is inconceivable. So Imam Abu Hanifa would say, well, Imam Abu Hanifa would say, well, this sentence is not necessarily gibberish. The sentence has a subject and a predicate. It exists, right? Even though it doesn't quite make sense, but we can still take a metaphorical meaning. Sahibain would say, no, this chair is a dog. That is a yes. The literal meaning exists. Like there's a sentence there, right? It's conveying in some kind of information. However, that information is of no value to us. There's no value in that information because it's inconceivable. The information is contradictory. So because it's contradictory, the information is contradictory. So therefore, because the literal meaning is impossible, we can't even go to the metaphorical meaning. The metaphorical meaning can't substitute a literal meaning that is inconceivable. That's what Sahibain say. So let's look at an example. The example is a person points to someone and says, that is my son. Right? Points to someone and says, that is my son. So he's pointed to this person and said, that's my son. Now, as a sentence, it's conveying information, right? He's attributing. So subject of that sentence is that thing that person that he's indicating towards, and then the information that's being conveyed is that it is his son, right? So Imam Abu Hanifa is happy. From a linguistic perspective, it's a sentence. Are Sahibain happy? Well, it turns out that the person he's pointing to is older than him. So this person A, points to person B, and person B actually turns out to be older than person A. So let's say I'm person A. I point to this person over here, and I'm in my 20s, that person is in their 40s. Well, then I'm pointing to somebody in their 40s and saying that is my son. That's inconceivable. That sentence can't be true, right? The sentence itself is valid, but there's an external reason, the context, there's an external reason why this sentence is not possible to understand. So what happens? Well, Sahibain would say this sentence is gibberish. This sentence is not gibberish, but this sentence, you can't take any meaning from this sentence. You can't take a literal meaning. You're not even allowed to go to a metaphorical. Imam Abu Hanifa would say, well, actually, no. The sentence itself is valid. It's the context that makes it invalid, right? It's this external cause that's making this sentence invalid. And so we can go to a metaphorical meaning, right? And what's that metaphorical meaning? That person I'm pointing to was actually my slave. So when I say he is my son, well, then I'm taking the metaphorical meaning that, he's no longer my slave and I've freed him. So that's what Imam Abu Hanifa would say. So let's backtrack slightly. Appreciate we've kind of gone on this explanation for quite a while. So let's backtrack slightly. We have this sentence, this person is my son. I've pointed to this 40-year-old person and, he's a slave, right? Let's say. Again, all hypothetical. This is just the example that's given in the book that I'm explaining. I've pointed to him. I'm in my 20s, he's in his 40s. Now, I've said, he is my son. Linguistically, the sentence is valid. I'm attributing the subject of the sentence is him, like the person I'm pointing to, and the information I'm conveying about him is that he is my son, that he is my son, right? So as a sentence, it's got a subject, it's got a predicate, information is being conveyed, it's a valid sentence. However, he's older than me, which makes it impossible for him to be my son. So an external factor has come about making this sentence invalid. Now, can you take a metaphorical meaning when the sentence is invalid? Imam Abu Hanifa says, the metaphorical meaning is a substitute for the literal down to the linguistic level in terms of the wording itself, right? So the metaphorical meaning is substituting the meanings of the words that I've said. So when I say, he is my son, right? Literally speaking, that is impossible because of this external factor that he is older than me. But Imam Abu Hanifa would say that actually this metaphorical meaning of what I'm actually meaning by that is I'm freeing him, it substitutes the words. So now I don't mean that he is my son, I mean that he is my slave and I'm freeing him. It's substituting the meaning of the words that I said, right? It's a direct linguistic substitute. Sahibain would say, no, you said these words had a meaning, and that meaning was impossible given this factor. They say that the metaphorical meaning can only substitute the outcome of the words that I said, right? So I say, he is my son. It can only substitute the ruling of the meaning. It can only substitute the outcome of the meaning. It can't substitute the meaning itself, right? This is the subtle point that I've been building up for the last 20 minutes plus to try and get to, right? So because it can't substitute the actual meaning, it can only substitute the outcome of the meaning. Because the meaning itself is impossible, well, then you can't even go to that outcome. There is no outcome to substitute, and so you can't go to a metaphorical meaning. So just to summarize, if the sentence is a valid sentence, it has a subject and a predicate, right? Well, then that's the first level. The next level is there something preventing the sentence from being valid, some external factor preventing the sentence from being valid? And that's where the difference of opinion lies. So Imam Abu Hanifa says that as long as the sentence itself is valid, well, then it doesn't matter if the meaning is invalid due to an external reason, because the metaphorical meaning can substitute the literal to the level of the meaning. So if the meaning is invalid, the metaphorical meaning can substitute the literal meaning here, and then that sentence will then be valid according to a metaphorical meaning. Now the Sahibain, they say that the sentence is valid, sure, but the meaning of the sentence is not valid due to this external factor that came about. And so therefore, and the metaphorical meaning can't substitute this invalid meaning. It can only substitute the outcome of that meaning. It can only substitute how you take that meaning. It can only substitute how we understand that meaning and apply a rule to it, right? It can only substitute the ruling that comes from that meaning. And so therefore, given that the meaning itself is invalid, well, the metaphorical can't substitute that. It can only substitute on the level of the ruling, not on the level of the meaning. It's like a third level. So the level is the sentence itself a valid sentence? Does the sentence have a valid understanding? Right? That's the level one. Does the sentence have a meaning? The second sentence, does that meaning make sense? Is there anything external preventing that meaning from being valid? The third level is, what ruling can we take from that meaning? Sahibain say on that level 3, that third level is where the metaphorical replaces. That means that level 1 and level 2 have to be valid. Imam Abu Hanifa says it substitutes on level 2, right? Where it substitutes the meaning, right? So if the meaning is not valid due to some external factor, well then that's still fine because it's substituting on level 2, right? Again, this is very theoretical. I do appreciate that, right? Which is why I've spent extra time trying to explain it in this way. However, I think overall it's a very simple concept once you understand it, but we had to go through quite a bit of a journey to understand that. So hopefully that makes sense, inshallah. Okay, so that was the first principle. We can now move on, but just before we do that, let me just quickly summarize the main points just one more time, just so you know exactly what you need to know here. So Imam Abu Hanifa says, actually let's say it like this. If you have a sentence with a subject and a predicate, then that sentence is a valid sentence. Now, if the meaning of that sentence is also valid, such that nothing external contradicts that meaning, making it inconceivable, then that sentence now has a valid meaning. And then finally, then you can then take a ruling from that meaning. So that's the 3 stages. Now, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, the metaphorical can only replace the literal, or can replace the literal on the level of the meaning. So in other words, if the meaning is not valid, the metaphorical meaning can replace the literal meaning and make it valid in that sense. Whereas the Sahibain say that the metaphorical can't replace the literal on the level of meaning, it can only replace it on the level of ruling. So therefore, if the meaning is invalid due to some external cause making the meaning invalid, then the metaphorical cannot replace the literal in this sense. You can't go to the metaphorical meaning. You're going to have to declare the sentence as an invalid sentence, and no ruling can be taken from that sentence. That is the summary of this third point. Moving on to the third principle, this is actually very similar to a previous principle that we've covered. If you recall, we talked about homonyms. And when we talked about homonyms, we said that, well, what is a homonym? Just a refresher. Homonym is where there's a word which has multiple individual meanings. It has multiple dictionary meanings that it refers to. That's a homonym. So we gave the example of the word bat. A bat can either mean a mammal, a flying mammal, or it can mean the object that you use to hit a ball with in certain sports. So there's 2 different meanings of bat, right? So we said that once you've intended one meaning of a homonym, once you've interpreted the homonym to have one meaning, the other meaning, that your ruling cannot now take into account the other meaning. The other meaning becomes invisible to consideration with respect to the ruling that you've derived from this text, right? Likewise, very similar happens with literal and metaphorical. If a word or a sentence has a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning, well then once you've chosen one of the two, for whatever reason, whatever principle or reason that you have chosen that one, whatever principle that meaning has been chosen, now you can't then go back and choose to mean the other one, right? Once you've intended the meaning of bat, once you've decided that the intent of the word bat was the object used in sport, now it's as if bat doesn't mean flying mammal in this case. The word flying mammal cannot now apply, right? You've chosen one meaning, the other one is now not possible to intend here. And there's a good example from the Quran, right? The Quran is describing actions. Well, the Quran is describing the ruling of tayammum, of doing tayammum when you don't have water. So if you don't have water to do wudu or to do ghusl, ghusl is the ritual bath after intercourse. If you don't have water in order to purify yourself to pray, well then you can do something called tayammum, right? Which is where you can utilize natural substances like sand or soil, etc., to perform an alternative, right? So we said tayammum was an alternative to wudu, right? So you can perform an alternative because water is unavailable for you to do wudu with. Likewise, if you don't have water to do a ghusl with, you do tayammum as an alternative to ghusl. So the Quran is describing this. The Quran is describing if this situation happens or if that situation happens and your wudu breaks or your ghusl breaks and you don't have water, well then do wudu, right? Sorry, do tayammum. So the verse is وَإِن كُنْتُم مَرْضَى, if you are ill, right? So if you're ill and you can't use water, right? That's what is the intended meaning. إِن كُنْتُم مَرْضَى أَوْ عَلَى سَفَرٍ أو على سفر أو جاء أحد منكم من الغائط أو لامستم النساء فلم تجدوا ماء, or you're on a journey and you can't find water, or you have the need to relieve yourself, or you have لامستم النساء. And I'm going to translate it literally here, right? First, we'll go to the metaphorical in a minute. But لامستم النساء has a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning. Actually, let's not translate it for now. We'll discuss that in a minute. So you have the need to defecate, or lamastumun nisa happens and you don't have water. You can't find water, then do tayammum. That's what the verse says. If you're ill and you can't find water, if you're ill and so you can't use water, that's the understanding. If you're ill, or you're on a journey and you can't find water, again, that's the understanding. So if you're ill or you're on a journey, or you have a need to defecate yourself, or you have the call to nature has come, and then you can't find water, right, in order to do wudu with, or lamastumun nisa happens and you don't have water to do wudu or ghusl with, then do tayammum. So we've got a list of things which can necessitate wudu or ghusl, right? A list of things. So like, for example, with a call to nature, you need to go toilet. That means that after that you have to do wudu, right? That's fairly simple. Then it says lamastumun nisa. So again, this is something which it's like in the same ruling as going toilet, right? So something which is gonna, by doing this thing, you're gonna have to do wudu or ghusl. Now, lamastumun nisa has a literal meaning. Literally, it just means touching women, right? You have touched a woman and you can't find water, then do tayammum. That's what happens if you take that meaning. The metaphorical meaning is you have had relations with a woman. You have had sexual relations with a woman, and therefore you can't find water in order for you to purify yourself. So do tayammum. That's the metaphorical meaning. Now, the scholars have chosen the metaphorical meaning here. They've chosen the meaning of sexual intercourse, that if you have had sexual intercourse with a woman and then you can't find water in order to perform the ritual bath with, to perform ghusl with, then do tayammum. once they've chosen that meaning now, you can't go back and say, oh, the sentence said touching women. We can take the literal meaning and get another ruling to say that touching women means that you have to do wudu. Does that make sense? So the sentence means, so we've got the sentence, if you are ill and you can't use water, or if you are on a journey and you can't find water, or if you have to go you've just had to go toilet, and or you've just had sexual relations with a woman and you can't find water in order for you to do wudu or ghusl with, then do tayammum. That's what the sentence says. You can't then go back and say, actually, there's an additional meaning here, the literal meaning of touching women. That implies that touching women also necessitates wudu, because that's the literal meaning here. And so also, if you touch a woman and you can't find water to do wudu with, then you can do tayammum. No, we're not taking that. We're not taking the meaning, because we've chosen the metaphorical meaning. We've said that lamastumun nisa means having sexual relations with a woman. Well, then now that doesn't, now you can't take the literal meaning. The literal meaning, it's as if it doesn't exist. Lamastumun nisa, in this situation, the meaning is having sexual relations with a woman. It doesn't mean touching women, right? So the principle is, once you've chosen one of the two meanings or one of the multiple meanings of that word, all of the other possible meanings now cease to exist for the sake of the ruling. So you can't now make a ruling with any of the other meanings. Multiple meanings of the same word cannot be used simultaneously for a ruling. That is the principle. That if the same word has multiple meanings, whether they're literal, metaphorical, or it's a homonym, well, then you can't, multiple meanings can't be used, multiple meanings for the same word can't be used simultaneously for a ruling from that text. So once you've intended the meaning of the metaphorical meaning of sexual relations, you now can't intend the literal meaning for any purpose, which is, literal touching. So touching a woman doesn't break your wudu. Now, obviously, if those of you who know the Shafi'i madhab, they know that the Shafi'is say that touching a woman does break your wudu. So you can see that their principle in regards to this will be different. And this is why you've got a difference of opinion in Hanafi and Shafi'i fiqh in regards to this issue, and in many issues. You can see why there's methodological differences. I think we'll leave it there for this part of the lesson, and then we'll do principle number 5 in the next part, inshallah. Okay, that was another relatively detailed lesson, and some challenging concepts we covered. So let's do the summary and the conclusion, and hopefully everything was explained quite clearly. I do appreciate you're going to need a long concentration span cover some of these concepts, because they are a bit dry and a bit complicated and a bit a bit challenging. But just a few lessons that we've had, this lesson and then the command lesson that we did previously, and maybe these three lessons have been a bit challenging. I think they're the only very challenging lessons that we have. The other lessons are, well, hopefully should be less complicated. Maybe one of the last two lessons might have a few challenging concepts, but we'll see that when we get there. But I think for the most part, the next couple of lessons should be relatively a lot more straightforward, inshallah. Anyway, let's with that said, let's get into the summary. Right. Firstly, we talked about how there's a difference of opinion in regards to how far the metaphorical is a substitute for the literal. So if the literal doesn't make sense, there's something preventing the literal from being valid, can the metaphorical substitute that or not? So do you dash the sentence and call it gibberish and say that there's no ruling that can be taken from here because it doesn't make sense and it's invalid? Or do we say, okay, it's invalid, but we can still take a metaphorical meaning? There's a difference of opinion there. We said Imam Abu Hanifa says that you can take the metaphorical meaning, right? Because the metaphorical meaning substitutes on the level of meaning, whereas the students of Imam Abu Hanifa said you can't take the metaphorical meaning because it only substitutes on the level of outcome. So what that means is you have a sentence which has a literal meaning, right? You have a sentence. If that sentence has a meaning, i.e. it's a valid sentence, then that's the first level, if it's a valid sentence. If it's not a valid sentence, everybody agrees that you can't take a metaphorical meaning. If I said chair, window, sky, right? Chair, window, sky. That's not a sentence. There's no meaning you can take from that. You can't take a metaphorical meaning from that either. Not allowed. Right? That's the first level. Second level, I say, that person is my son. He's actually older than me, but I say, that person is my son. Valid sentence, right? You can take a meaning from that. However, there's something preventing that meaning from being valid, because the fact that that person is older than me means it's impossible for him to be my son. There's a contradiction there, but it's due to an external cause, not due to the sentence itself. Sentence itself is valid. The sentence is valid, external cause prevents it from being valid. Now here there's a difference of opinion. Imam Abu Hanifa says the sentence is valid. Forget the external cause, the sentence is valid, so this you can take the metaphorical meaning. The metaphorical meaning substitutes the invalid meaning here. So the metaphorical meaning which is valid substitutes the invalid meaning here. Right? My bottle just dropped. Right? So he says that you can take the metaphorical meaning. Sahibain say you can't take the metaphorical meaning. You can't take the metaphorical meaning because the sentence is invalid. The literal is invalid. The metaphorical substitutes on the level of ruling. It doesn't substitute the meaning. So the meaning here is invalid because of that external thing causing the meaning to be invalid. Well, then the metaphorical meaning isn't going to help, because the metaphorical meaning doesn't substitute the meaning according to them. The metaphorical meaning only substitutes the outcome of that meaning, right? And so then we went through the example of, this is my son. So Imam Abu Hanifa would say, this is my son, if and that person happened to be my slave, right? Again, they love slavery examples in the usul books for some reason, so this is what we're going to go with. So if somebody said, that is my son, and that person was older than him, right, and that person was also their slave, then Imam Abu Hanifa would say, okay, he's saying that is my son. What he means by that is he's free just like my son, and so we'll take the metaphorical meaning. Sahibain say he is my son doesn't make any sense. It's an invalid sentence, and the metaphorical meaning can't have an impact here because the literal meaning doesn't make any sense, right? And because that sentence itself is problematic, so we're going to just dash the sentence. That was the third point. Again, a bit of a tricky point, right? That one's quite relatively tricky. Moving on, fourth point. Fourth point, very simple. You have a sentence, it has a literal meaning, a metaphorical meaning. Whichever one you choose, you can't choose the other one, right? Just like we said for homonyms, bat. If you choose the one meaning of bat, you can't go with the other one. Likewise, you have a sentence, it has a literal meaning, metaphorical meaning, you can't choose once you've chosen one, you can't choose the other one. The example we gave was أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, right? So we're talking about wudu and tayammum, and things that break wudu and things that the Quran mentions various examples of where if these situations happened and your wudu broke or your ghusl broke, then and you needed to do wudu and you didn't have water, then you can do tayammum, right? So one of those things is أَوْ لَامَسْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ. The literal meaning of that is if you touch women. If you touch women and you don't have water, then do tayammum, right? That's one meaning. Or the metaphorical meaning, if you cohabitate with women, if you had done intercourse with a woman, right? If you had done intercourse with women, or with a woman rather, then you couldn't find water, then do tayammum. So the Hanafi scholars have taken the meaning of cohabitate, right? And so therefore, once you've chosen the meaning of cohabitate and sexual intercourse, you can't then go back and use the literal meaning at all here. That we've chosen the metaphorical, the literal goes out of the picture. That's the fourth principle.